For adapting so quickly. You also have to adapt to no slides. I will upload these nonetheless as a form of notes. But mostly what you have in the piece of that my piece with Talas Sayed on reconstructing class analysis is mostly what I want to lay out. Today's session is about class and agency, and in particular, I want to start us out with a little bit of a look at how to think about class in capitalism and what class analysis is for, if it's for anything. And then we'll continue the conversation from there. So, the first thing to recognize is that there are the standard liberal way to talk about class is to think in terms of percentiles or deciles, essentially as income and consumption packets across the population that reflect income, market-based income, where market-based income is a function of task-relevant attributes that individuals have, and individuals have these attributes by virtue of luck, effort, some combination of all of these. Crucially, in liberal conceptions of class, to the extent they have them at all, class is a fluid phenomenon. Mobility is the key to a classless society. And essentially, if people intergenerationally can move from one class to the other, then we are in a classless society. Liberal theories of justice, therefore, primarily focus on either compensating for bad luck, so that's John Rawls' theory of justice, or some combination of bad luck and poor choices, so that's Dworkin's version with avoiding moral hazard, with more or less generous programs for addressing the bad luck by investing publicly. So Bruce Ackerman's Social Justice and the Liberal State is an example of a particularly ambitious program of correcting the lack of luck in endowments going into markets. But fundamentally, class is an individual attribute. It's about a location in the ability to consume, and it reflects the fit between the talent and effort of individuals, some luck, some choice, and a reasonably well-functioning labor market remunerating people for what they have. A second set of approaches that sociologists of class in particular use are Weberian approaches, broadly speaking. The crucial difference between this, broadly speaking, approach to class is that even though it keeps the idea that markets more or less price labor correctly, but insists that the attributes that individuals have do not come from bad luck or choice, but rather come from opportunity hoarding, from institutionalized opportunity hoarding. So the classic case here would be parents with college and advanced degree education invest in their children and use legacy admissions to preserve admissions. That makes their children very proficient at some set of tasks, and those tasks are correctly remunerated in the market. So the Weberian frameworks primarily focuses on opportunity hoarding. The injustice is not in the ways in which the market operates internally, but in the ways in which the opportunities to participate in the market are distributed. And obviously that's the framework that is most directly conducive to a lot of our policies with regard to affirmative action in admissions and hiring and promotion as a direct reversal of the most prevalent practices of opportunity hoarding. And the third set of schools in the sociology class are various Marxian approaches. And here, those of you who want to dig deeper on this three-dimensional approach to class or characterization of theories of class, you could look at Eric Olin Wright's Understanding Class as the introduction to the 2015 book, as a compact way of looking at them. Crucially, in Marxian analysis, there is one dimension. There is one dimension of differentiation of class, and that is property. And in most versions of orthodox Marxism, property in the means of production. In the political Marxism of Robert Brenner and those who follow him, it's also market dependence for subsistence and control over property in the means of subsistence as an even more foundational point. Class is the presence or absence, in orthodox Marxist view of class, of property in the means of subsistence and production. It structures power in relation to surplus, with the idea of surplus depending on an idea of all value coming from labor, capital essentially doing no labor, but only permitting labor to use property in exchange for extracting all of the value. And the surplus there is between the objective labor value and the minimal necessity to reproduce labor, as in classical political economy, as well as with respect to domination in the hidden abode of production, as Marx called it, the habituated practice of submission to authority, creating a hierarchical relation of conflicts within production around this, that is structured by property relation and enacted in the ritualized daily submission. And that's kind of at the broadest level, the core characteristic of orthodox Marxist theories of class. And obviously within each school there are lots of variations. Within the Weberian school, I'd say Pierre Bourdieu is the most widely understood as focused specifically on elaboration of how consumption and taste and high culture become markers and components of class, much closer to Weber's original use of status than the way in which today's sociologists describe class. In the new institutional economy, in the approach that Tala Sayed and I developed here in this piece that we gave you to read, class is asymmetric position in social relations of production, asymmetric position that reflect institutionalized differences in power over access to the means of subsistence and production. And these institutionalized differences are inherited from prior rounds on prior struggles over institutions that structure control over the primary components of production: labor, nature, knowledge, and time and uncertainty as in credit. This assumes, as I stated to you in the first and second classes, that power is pervasive, in market societies, that wages and income are structured by population level dynamics, and there's no such thing as an objective value separate from there's no such thing as an objective value separate from, is this too loud? Too loud. Better? There's no such thing as an objective surplus or value from which to extract, to understand value. And power is anchored in institutionalized differential control over the components of production, which then distribute power in production over who gets to work with whom, using what resources, doing what, producing how much of what, and who gets what from the fruits of this joint effort of production, and who determines the answers to these questions. The crucial, so this approach begins with the same fundamental division that Marxism begins with. That is to say, property in resources, property in nature, is one major axis of class differentiation, those who have property and those who don't. But the Marxist theory essentially has no real explanation for the persistent presence of a petty bourgeoisie. They're kind of a non-class, middle class, somewhat class, maybe class, and that makes it very awkward. Therefore, we add a second dimension, which is the dimension of whether labor is manual or cognitive, a measure that is also scalar in terms of the amount of knowledge in production required, with knowledge in production being both embodied in the body, codified, able to be expressed in a written form codified for management, and embedded in material culture, that is to say technology, which can be owned as property by producers. This simple move gives us a much richer variation of classes with three primary profit-reaping classes. The capitalists, who are now acknowledged as doing labor in production, as well as owning property in the resources necessary for production. The rentiers, who only have property in the resources necessary for production and do no cognitive work in management of the materials. Rentiers historically might have been more just landowners, but even as early as the 17th and certainly by the 18th century, the earliest capitalist societies already had very large and powerful financial rentier classes whose inherited wealth played out as financial resources to call on resources in production. And the professional managerial class, who do no cognitive work, who do cognitive work, but own no resources in production. Beyond these, there are smallholders who remain important in capitalist societies contra the industrial era framing of Marxists that these are an old story. There are rural smallholders, we talked about them earlier in the semester. There are urban smallholders, shopkeepers, small business owners who mostly work with their own body and the small and maybe families, sometimes with a handful of employees, but are persistent as a large portion of the economy. And they are in potential conflict with capitalists, and they're not just a middle ground. They are a distinctive class occupying this position of doing manual labor and owning, as well as cognitive labor, and owning some of the means of production, the resources. There are craft or skilled workers who have high embodied knowledge but do manual work. There are clerical classes who do cognitive work but at a lower level of knowledge intensity, who are different from the professional managerial class and different from the craft workers who do manual class and have different interests and sometimes are organized differently. And there are the unskilled or semi-skilled classes who are distinguished from the skilled workers by how long it takes to acquire the skills they need to fill the role they fill in production. So that's the seventh class within this framework. The final dimension that we add, is recognition as full juridical persons. This comes out of the fact that the core legitimating frame of capitalism is to hide the exploitative relation behind a veil of equality between juridically equal people, who then agree to enter into relations of certain kinds of production with certain distribution of fruits of labor. And yet, throughout the history of capitalism, the pursuit of profit has repeatedly caused and driven the reproduction of stark divisions of atavistic status subordination, primarily of the form of racialization and gendering of those excluded from recognition as full juridical persons. And this is not a side effect, an additional attribute, something that just happens to align or is independent, but rather is constitutive of capitalism. And when we look, and you'll see in the paper, the table that we have there, when we look going all the way back to the 17th century, what you see is that in every techno-institutional wave, there is some class of workers who are recreated as atavistically subordinated, and therefore creating an underclass of workers who are subject to super exploitation and put pressure on the normative workers who are recognized as judicially equal. That starts from the factory and the field system in Barbados with the racialization of plantation workers of African descent. It continues in the parliamentary enclosures with women and children as the first industrial labor force in England, as well as the racialized enslaved workers in the American South. And it continues since then in every single wave, whether it's the Eastern European and Southern European immigrants who filled the first half of the American industrialization in the East, and the Chinese workers who filled railroad production in the West, whether it's the Great Migration, once anti-immigrant constraints limit access to that atavistically status subordinated work group. There's recruitment of black workers from the South with the first wave of the Great Migration. Whether it's the guest workers in Europe to deal with the end of the so-called golden age of capitalism, or whether it's married women introduced into flexible arrangements of work in the creation of the poor working conditions in the services economy in the 1970s, leveraging the ideology of the women's movement to bring married women into relations that are exploited. The point is, these are not independent events. These are an internal dynamic to profit-seeking capitalism to continuously produce and reproduce a status-subordinated group of workers who today is exploding in the anti-immigrant framework as immigrants, and in particular immigrants of irregular status, have filled that role in the last 30 or 40 years across most societies as successes of the women's movement and some civil rights movement successes have rendered prior dimensions of atavistic status subordination less easily directly exploitable, although still quite significantly so. All of which leaves us with the basic question of, so that's the basic theory of class. If we have these three dimensions of property and knowledge and eligibility to juridical equality, we get a richer and more historically realistic conception of class, where class is not identity, and it's not just in relation to property, but class is institutionalized asymmetric position in social relations of production, where the asymmetry is the function of the institutionalized asymmetric power over crucial elements in production. Resources for property, knowledge, and juridical recognition in equality. What do we need it for? What role does it play? First, I think well done, suitably restructured and reconstructed class analysis allows us to provide a far more accurate explanation of the dynamics of that structure, how life actually goes in capitalist societies. Because if you remember from the first class, I said most of life goes for most people is clicking I agree. It's not actually sitting at the table and negotiating for everything. Most of the conditions of social life in capitalism are already pre-structured in inherited institutions over which we only have ritualized submission, not actual control. The central, given that capitalism is the system in which market reach occupies all of life and incessantly forces everyone to instrumentalize their labor, their knowledge, their relations in the pursuit of making money to make a living and to stay wherever they are in terms of their role in production. Position in social relations of production, the ability to have power in these relations, out of which we make the money we need to live or to stay and continuing to do what we do. Position in those relations along these dimensions dramatically determines the life conditions of most people in society most of the time. And so most of economic life is structured not by individual choice but by class position as defined in this more sociologically realistic but still analytically contained structure. And class is not an identity to be cherished or valued. It's an asymmetric relation to be transformed and eliminated to the extent feasible. A classless society is a classless where there are no systematically asymmetric institutionalized relations of production. And the question is how to get there. Understanding the actual distribution of class, who occupies what class and why, helps us understand in every techno-institutional regime what the populations are that are occupying different class positions, what their relative interests are with respect to different configurations of the techno-institutional framework, and therefore who are potential coalition allies and who are potential coalition enemies. If you remember, it was actually in this class, in the makeup class, and very few of you were here, but perhaps you saw the video or looked at the slides. I used this system of class to give a very fine-grained diagnosis of how different views of AI mapped onto different class coalitions based on how they squeezed embodied knowledge with embedded knowledge, how they squeezed codified knowledge, how essentially Dario Amodei's utopia creates the possibility of a broad cross-class coalition against that capitalist artificial general intelligence utopia. But there are deep internal tensions between the paraprofessional and clerical class and the PMC about whether AI leads to a better trained and more capable knowledge worker who is not part of the long many years of professional managerial class but is upskilled from the clerical class, as opposed to the professional managerial class who loses their particular advantage. You suddenly see, I talked about the ways in which smallholders can become an escape outlet for the professional managerial class, and gave you the example there from what's been going on to some extent in medicine and to some extent in law. And finally, the components, the potential components of a class coalition behind the social democratic conception of AI, given who will benefit and who will lose, but only in opposition to what are now the profit-reaping classes through public AI. So the point is here not to restate all of that, but just to give you a concrete example of how a suitably sociologically correct description of class in analytically tractable terms gives us a much richer purchase on what are the conflicts in society over production as techno-institutional waves advance, how they change in different societies because of different class structures, why it is that we see robotics actually complementing labor in Europe but displacing labor in the US because of existing different class coalitions. What it was about the class coalitions in the Nordics, where clerical class and women unions both succeeded in mobilizing sufficiently to prevent the degrading of labor that was associated in the US with the shift to a services economy. In each case, you can map both the politics and the unionization, mobilization strategies along successful identification of class coalitions, which you cannot understand when you have a binary workers versus capital, because you're lumping too many together, and you simply don't respond to it if you think that class is just how much money you make based on your individualized lucky or not lucky. So that's where I'm starting.
So shall I speak now, or should we have some discussion?
You should speak, or we should have some discussion.
Yeah, let's have some discussion, and then I'll speak.
I guess that was an invitation to you
I think they didn't get the message.
that was an invitation to you to push back, query, ask, disagree, express puzzlement. Yes, Elsa.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. No?
Can you hear her back there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. This is more of a invitation to elaborate / a thought question. I found the piece on gender as an axis particularly interesting. So you conclude, I believe, with an Angela Davis quote about the socialization of domestic work and the socialization of not just childcare, but also the meal preparation and things that sort of go along with that. In reaction to that, I'm thinking about this, I think it was Rosa Luxemburg, who asks, what kind of independence do we gain if we go out from the house and then go to an office, into a factory, into whatever? So my question is kind of, okay, socialization of housework, what then? I think that's an opportunity to think about more broadly the concept of wage labour and its necessity in the current system. And so my thought would be, this is an invitation to think about the post-growth literature in challenging current modes of measuring value in the economy, the sort of premises that we hold about that.
Okay, so there's a lot there. Let me just repeat because it wasn't captured, and also it'll let me make sure, help you make sure that I don't drop the things that are most important to you. You're asking about you're starting with the gender component of the analysis, and specifically the quote at the end to Angela Davis with respect to the elimination of housework as the goal of all socialists. And you move then to what once we leave the house, how, and the question of wage labor, and the question and then you bring from that the question of post-growth, and so these are all quite distinct. Let me try to suggest why they're distinct, and then invite you to tell me why I'm wrong. there's the question of social reproduction and the extent to which capitalism depends on externalizing the costs of reproducing the worker to women, primarily. The households generally, but to women primarily within an asymmetric relation. And the claim, and Davis's claim there is very much focused on that part of the story, which is correct, independent of what happens when you're out of the house. So you can imagine a situation where, so the primary dynamic there, and that's where we focus mostly on Fulber, but it can also be Nancy Fraser, whom we also mentioned there. It's the feedback effect between asymmetric roles in social relations of reproduction, feeding into asymmetric position because status subordinated in social relations of production, feeding under a condition of complete dependence on market for subsistence into a different negotiating position in social relations of production, creating a feedback effect where subordination in relations of social reproduction leading to subordination in social relations of production, and subordination in social reproduction reinforcing subordination in social relations of reproduction. That's so breaking the first in that regard is already a precursor to breaking that feedback loop in social relations of production, and is distinctively important to the asymmetries in both. Once you see that asymmetric social relations of reproduction are gender and status subordination is constitutive of as a profit-oriented orientation within capitalism. So that's a distinct intervention, irrespective, because it's a constitutive component of how capitalism functions. So that's, in that sense, I think that's a symbol. Second, there is a class of strategies toward transcending wage labor, having to do with moving to small holding, essentially independent production, to cooperativism, that do not necessitate a post-growth accounting approach, because, as Professor Unger has been saying throughout, it's precisely to achieve everyone at the most advanced practice of production, which means continuous productivist investment in productivity growth, particularly when you're focused on countries that are not the richest, that nonetheless allows you to pursue transcending wage labor, independent of post-growth. And you can imagine a post-growth which defines all sorts of different things that doesn't actually produce the ability to be self-sustaining as cooperative and self-sustaining, and presents a different kind of challenge in the context of a global capitalist economy in which the removal from a growth-oriented strategy of a single society puts it in geopolitical competition with other societies, as well as getting capital to escape. So you don't actually solve capitalism, you find yourself in a potentially risky target position. So that's why I'm saying I see why you connect them, but I see them as distinct, and each one bearing its own value in analysis, its own institutionalized solutions. And the one I confess I am the most skeptical of is the post-growth component.
So, I think particularly the geopolitical tension, I think, is the point is well taken. I think that's a very reasonable critique. I think maybe the way to think about it for me to put the claim, which I've learned maybe I need to write about this for the paper, is that adopting post-growth premises may give rise to conditions in which the sexual reproduction of labor would be less prominent. I think that's the claim.
Repeat the last sentence, in which
the sexual division of labor would be less prominent or less necessary.
You'd have to basically lay out the argument for that. I mean, it doesn't pop up to me
Okay.
of its own, but worth reading the argument.
This is a thought that I'm baking, but I wanted to put it out there.
Mhm.
This is kind of like a 20,000-foot question that,
Where else are we hanging out?
yeah, exactly. So, and I guess I'm drawing on like Steve Chabelle a little bit here. I'm gonna try to put you in conversation with Steve Chabelle, if you don't mind. So, like, in thinking about like just your entire framework of like trying to enhance people's staying power and withholding power to make them not dependent on markets for subsistence, and then that sort of allows them to have increased bargaining power and like just all of that. How do you like reconcile, at least how do you decide the correct like level of, let's say, like a universal basic income, just as like a stand-in for like a way to remove market dependence on subsistence? How do you decide the appropriate level so that you give people the necessary staying power without undermining like incentives to work? I think that's just like obviously like the fundamental, and that's why I said it's a 20,000 foot book. I feel like that's like the fundamental tension at the core of like your entire theory. And so I just wonder like how do you actually determine that as like a mechanical question?
So just to be clear, Steve Chabelle has no idea either.
Sure.
It's not as though markets actually produce anything remotely like a third distant cousin of anything efficient.
Yeah.
No, once you say yeah, we're now in the context of
Well, no, yeah, I mean,
we will need to experiment with it. The probability and bracket. I think universal basic income is not a solution in the sense that it's an invitation to be absorbed within markets. It's essentially a consumption. It's not a production-oriented strategy. It's a consumption-oriented strategy, and therefore, at the end of the day, it'll just be absorbed within standard capitalist dynamics as a form of inflationary framework, as well as not being countercyclical or susceptible to countercyclical constraint. That's the bracket that. But the point you're saying is, how do you get it exactly right that people will still... The point is to understand production, not in terms of an unpleasant thing you have to do and you have to be paid exactly enough in order to do it, but rather how do you transform work so that work is a meaningful activity for people out of which they get meaning. The point is the whole conception. So essentially I push back on two dimensions. One, the alternative of labor markets does not get anything calibrated right. We don't have exactly the right level of effort to produce exactly the right level of welfare. What we have is a set of imperatives that force people to sell their labor, with the majority of them in the US under degrading conditions, out of which they may get no meaning and from which they are utterly alienated, resulting in a condition of broad anomie in society that is currently expressing itself in authoritarian politics. So it's not that hard of a hurdle to beat that. But again, I think, but the point is to create the conditions of universal, meaningful work for people to have the freedom, the real freedom from market imperatives, to pursue the work they consider to be meaningful. That is the correct level. There is no too much production or too little production if everybody is able to meet their basic needs, understood broadly, and pursue meaningful work free of the imperatives of market. It's a conception of freedom, of real freedom from market imperatives, rather than efficient output at a societal level, which doesn't actually exist because all that measures is some set of transactions that are then hypothetically identified as welfare enhancing. So that's my basic answer to that.
I just had like one question related to your answer there. Like Sam Altman in the past year has said his like aspiration for LLMs is to turn into sort of like a public utility, like it's on a meter and you pay for intelligence in the same way you pay for water. And if that were successful, that would suggest that there is no like joie de vivre around work and production, right? People would rather just pay for intelligence versus using their productive capacity to build their own. Like how would you say to like reconcile those two things? Because if we see empirically that people would rather just pay a tech company to do sort of like human knowledge labor, doesn't that suggest that there probably isn't such a universal desire?
So I think that's if what you mean is that people will sit in pods doing nothing, I think that's a poor prediction of how things will play out. If what you mean is people will use LLMs the way I use LLMs now in my research, then it's just a tool. It's a really good tool, but the question remains whether you're using the tool in the pursuit of a goal you define in a way that you're actually producing something you care about, and that is in some sense, and that is related to your creating something meaningful in the world. So whether intelligence is a public utility, first of all, the word intelligence as the output is itself already half determines what we're thinking about what matters, right? You could imagine, you could and should imagine a situation where the machines become smart enough that we can add the additional creative component of deciding, or the relationship component with somebody else, that this provides inputs we don't have. None of that predetermines that the completion of a project is not itself meaningful now that we've used a particular tool that is, let's call it intelligence, or some form of human intelligence. I don't see those as necessarily opposed. It's only if the use of the tool replaces everything that is creative and relational in the thing we're doing that you stand the risk of losing the possibility of meaningful work. But maybe I've misstated what you were referring Altman as suggesting.
I think it's just like amongst my peers in my age group, I just kind of assume, like my presumption that people would just consume short form media all day if they didn't have to like use their knowledge capacity to do labor. But I think that's just like a difference in presumption.
So, but again, what you're describing is the cognition of the condition of consciousness of a population that is habituated to make itself available for profitable entertainment. Right? You're already talking about a degraded state of being that is the project of a commodified culture whose design is to grab your eyeballs. So that people will do that is already a historically specific outcome of a particular techno-institutional framework in which grabbing eyeballs for marketing is one of the least trade exposed sectors, and therefore a place where you have massive investment when making stuff that's material is elsewhere. So I'm not claiming that taking a snapshot of culture at a given moment, given the ways in which desire, wants, needs are manufactured for profit, will result in liberation. I'm saying set up a system in which that isn't the only way in which things are produced, and you can begin to shift away from from a culture that produces passive consumers as its major output. Yes,
So if, can you hear me okay?
yes.
So if class is primarily structured by institutionalized power over production rather than income or opportunity, how should policymakers rethink interventions like AI regulation or education to reform or to avoid unintentionally creating these existing class hierarchies?
So we sketch out at the end of the piece what we see as the primary implication, and that's a thick conception of access, universal access to basic needs and goods, in order to restrict and constrain market dependence for subsistence, and socialization of labor markets, credit markets, infrastructure, production. Actually, we don't say that there. That is more in the book that I gave you, the final chapter in the first or second class. Socialization of labor market, infrastructure, and credit markets to actually make it feasible for people to pursue their own projects. And so this is so partly it's reducing the imperative to sell your labor by constraining, and partly it's the recognition that in fact our labor relations are not individual contracts, except for a tiny sliver at the top. The overwhelming majority of people are slotted into labor markets over which they have no control. They're like, I agree. And so what you need is democratic determination of what the conditions are, some form of union level negotiation at the sector level, plus administrative generalization, so that the terms of labor are set at the class level and at the sectoral level, not at the individual level. That access to credit comes from a much richer range of credit institutions that are socially embedded or reflect social priorities through investment in real economy production rather than through the financial means we need now. So what you need is essentially a social embedding of production rather than its separation from social determination through markets. So it requires a much more fundamental restructuring of production away from these core institutional elements of capitalism. But specifically, the focus on class is to understand that most of these answers cannot be at the level of individual choice and contract. It can't be choice and consent. So coming back to your point about AI regulation, the idea that transparency is what's going to do the trick, or that there will be an opt-out of a certain way, that's just distraction. Instead, what you need is significant public investment in AI as infrastructure that is designed to create the opportunities to use AI in ways that are labor enhancing. So coming back to the question of we should have a massive investment in training paraprofessionals to be able to provide health using these systems at a much higher level than there is now, so as to both increase access to health and increase ways of making a meaningful living for people in healthcare, rather than limiting it to the small number of physicians who then can use these systems to get rid of the paraprofessionals and minimize the paraprofessionals. That's a strategic investment in what the class arrangements around AI are for a given sector. And the same, of course, then can play out in many other, though not necessarily in all sectors. Do you want to speak a bit?
Sure. So I'm going to make 3 or 4 sets of remarks. I'm going to begin with remarks on the conception of a class system and on the general contours of a class system in an advanced society. Then I want to make remarks addressed to the perspective of some of the major classes identified in this scheme. And finally, I want to end with a discussion of the programmatic implications of our diagnosis of class. So first, I understand a class system as the division of society into social groups whose hierarchical place in the system of production and in the material life of society is determined decisively by the hereditary transmission of differential economic and educational advantage through the family. Now, I think it's interesting to point out that both Karl Marx and Adam Smith believed in different forms that a class system was functionally required and in some sense explained by its coercive function. That for Marx, class was the necessary instrument for the coercive extraction of a surplus. And even for Adam Smith, the degradation that he described in the factory system was necessary for the factory system to work. I think they were both mistaken. There's no reason to believe, given what we now know about the economic circumstances in Britain and the other European societies, that the degree of coercive extraction experienced was in any sense necessitated by the economic realities of that country. So we have to look in a different direction for an explanation. The study of a class system raises 2 basic kinds of difficulties that are characteristic of all of social thought. The first difficulty is that in every instance it includes both a subjective element, an element related to consciousness, and an objective element related to place and to function. So there is, on the one hand, the place that each group occupies in the social division of labor and in the technical division of labor. The technical division being the level in the productive unit, in the actual process of production, as opposed to the specialization of the classes in the large. And on the other hand, there is the consciousness or the identity of the class. So that presents the first set of difficulties, which is shared by every major theme in social thought, including the most important, which is the theory of regimes. Now, the second difficulty is that with respect to class, we find that you can't understand the position of any particular class except in relation to factors that may seem distant from the immediate reality of class, but are really not. So, for example, in my references to the economic elite, to the asset-holding class, I'm going to emphasize the importance of the dominant style of politics in the United States and other rich Western countries, a low-energy democracy, but also the importance of the central banks and the fiat currency in the creation or reproduction of this class. So that the importance of going from the general map to the particular description is to be able to deal with these most interesting features of a class order. Now let me begin with the asset-holding class, the professional and managerial class, but by calling it the asset-holding class, I want to emphasize a different aspect of its reality. Well, let me step back a moment and say this. In all of the advanced Western societies, there is a quite similar class order. The class order has at the top an elite of rich people, sometimes called the professional managerial class, and that I will prefer to describe as an asset holding class. Then it has a small business class corresponding to what in earlier classes I call the objective petty bourgeoisie. Then it has the workers, traditionally divided into blue collar and white collar, but I think a more telling and discriminating analysis would be to distinguish them as credentialed or uncredentialed workers in ways that I will explain. And then there is a racially stigmatized underclass. And these classes exist in one form or another in many of the advanced Western societies, and ours were the point of convergence. Now let's begin with the asset holding class, the top class. At their pinnacle, of course, is an elite of fabulously wealthy plutocrats, but we can disregard them for the purposes of this discussion. The fundamental reality of the asset holding class is that in a country like the United States, there is a basic division between people who have capital and people who don't. So if you have capital in the United States, it's easy to make more capital. It's easy to make money if you have money. If you don't have money, it's very hard to make it. And you have to spend a few years, for example, as an indentured laborer to a law firm to acquire the degree of capital that will allow you then to make more capital. Now, what's the basis of this fundamental division in the experience of the elite? The basis of it is the vast power that is exercised by the central banks in the climate of fiat currency, literally to create wealth, to produce money out of nothing, and to manipulate monetary and fiscal policy in a way that leaves the asset holding class happy. And that in turn, that situation in which power is described under the subterfuge of the supine discipline of economics is made possible by the existence of a certain style of democracy, which I characterize as a low-energy democracy. Containment of popular mobilization, a slowing down of politics through the deliberate perpetuation of impasse, and a treatment of centralized experiment by the state and decentralized experiment by the parts of a federation or a confederation, as if they were opposites rather than what they are in fact, which is complements. And that's the fundamental reality of this asset holding class. So in fact, it contains two quite different classes in a way, if we distinguish between those who have capital and those who don't. Now we come to the small business class. The objective small business class that I described in earlier interventions. This is a class which in the United States has always punched above its weight and exercises large influence in the country. And you can be a member of this class, the traditional small business class. You can own a garage or a laundromat and have several $1 million. So the members of the small business class can actually be, compared to almost any other country in the world, rich. But they live segregated lives, ensconced in their small businesses and in their local community life. That's the small business class. Then there are the workers, Now with the workers, we could distinguish them between credentialed and uncredentialed according to 3 criteria. The first criterion is education, of course. The second criterion is professional association, professionalism. There is a dynamic of professionalism in American society and culture. And the third criterion is proximity to the elite, to the manager, to the professional managerial elite, to the asset holding class. The habit of dealing with them on an almost daily basis. The uncredentialed class, the uncredentialed workers, are the workers who don't satisfy these 3 criteria. And they have become the basis of the conservative ascendancy in the United States. So the conservative ascendancy, which was established in the second half of the 20th century, has 2 presuppositions. The first presupposition is the practice that the movement in power will distribute material advantages to the moneyed class, the moneyed part of the asset holding class, and distribute immaterial or moral advantages to the relatively impoverished members of the so-called middle class. Now, notice that in the description I at no point spoke of the middle class, because strictly speaking, on this view, a middle class doesn't exist. So one could ask, what is a middle class? A middle class is a worker with a bourgeois identity. And in the United States, a worker is particularly a member of this uncredentialed middle class and a candidate for support of the authoritarian and right-wing movements in power. Now finally we come to the racially stigmatized underclass. And it can only be understood historically out of the tragedy of African slavery. There were 4 positions classically in the United States. There was an accommodationist position, the position taken by Booker T. Washington, for example, that saw the freed slaves as petty proprietors and entrepreneurs, assimilated by the dominant structure. Then the second position was the position of escape, escape from the United States, theoretically return to Africa. Now what's interesting is this position was for the most part a feint. It was almost never implemented, in fact, in its intended form by those who proposed it, though it was implemented by other people. And what in fact happened was it became a mimic to what seemed to be its opposite, the petty bourgeois respectability, which is what you see with Farrakhan and so forth. Then there was a third position, which is the racial orthodoxy of the United States, which is exemplified by affirmative action. And the racial orthodoxy could be described as a threshold approach. The essential point is racial injustice must be separated from class injustice, and it must be addressed prior to addressing class injustice as a separate matter. This is the racial orthodoxy. The achievement of the racial orthodoxy is the creation or consolidation of a black professional business elite, but in every other respect it has been a disaster for the United States. It has generated benefits that are in inverse proportion to the need for them. It has benefited most of all the black professional and business elite. It has benefited less the working class blacks in government employment like policemen and firemen, and of course, least of all, it has benefited the mass of poor young black men who fill the American prisons and the secondary part of the labor market. It has alienated the blacks from their natural leadership, and it has repelled the white working class of the country, which with some justice feels itself to be the victim of an association between the sanctimonious white elites and the sanctimonious and self-dealing black elites. So altogether, a disastrous way of dealing with this problem in the history of the country, and part of the explanation of the conservative ascendancy. Now then we come to the final question, with what should be the programmatic sequel to this. And I want to say, for the purposes of our conversation here, that there are basically two programmatic responses to this tragedy of class in the United States. One is the social democratic response, and its essence is that we should populate society with a series of havens of protections against markets. Or to use the other language of decommodification. And the other response is a productivist response, which says, the only distributivist solution that is worth thinking about is a distributivist solution which is anchored in a productivist imperative. If that's true even in Sweden, a country of less than 11 million people, with the past that it has, how much more so in the United States with 300 million people and a radically different reality. And the priority focus of a productivist project in the United States that would begin to deconstruct the class system would be the focus on the creation of a knowledge economy for the many to replace what the country's building, which is a knowledge economy for the few. And some of its characteristic initiatives would be among those that Yochai just described when he talked about the massive education of those who would operate such an economy. But the central theme is the theme of agency, precisely the theme that you chose for today, to turn the tables on the structure and to begin to undermine it from below, and then to reach its intellectual and political conditions, such as the conditions that permit the asset-holding class to strengthen its domination over the country. That's what I want to say.
I think we might want to follow a similar process where we invite from you first and then.
Yes.
Okay, this doesn't work. You use the phrase distributionist solution angled in a productivist imperative. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Anchored in. That is, so yes, and it was a failure of mine not to say a little bit more about that. So imagine, for example, a 21st century equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension, in which the state needs money. It needs money not just to secure people, the most vulnerable for their basic needs, but to develop these initiatives which would signal and embody a new stage of innovation in the organization of the market. And specifically in this case, with respect to the organization of the knowledge economy. So it's creating a knowledge economy of the type adumbrated by Biden's CHIPS Act, for example, is not an example of what I'm saying. It's an example of subsidies to capital. It doesn't change anything in the fundamental reality of the countries. It just provides more facility to finance data centers. But the kinds of initiatives that I'm mentioning would be capital intensive. And they would necessarily compete with generic distributivist initiatives. Now, of course, we should reserve a rescue operation for the most vulnerable and the most needy. But we shouldn't translate that into a generic initiative to decommodify large parts of social life and establish in this way a vicious rivalry between the capital-intensive productivist initiatives that I'm describing, which are marshaled in the service of social inclusion and agency, and these initiatives that are designed to pay people off and to give everyone a coupon that you can clip at the end of the month. That's the sense of it.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in? Let me ask you a bit of clarification. In the piece you circulated, and in prior conversations,
You mean overthrowing the dictatorship of no alternatives, that piece?
yes,
Okay.
and in prior conversations in this class, in this course, you emphasize the difference between the core class differentiation that you describe as the differentiation between the rich, the objective petty bourgeoisie, and the subjective petty bourgeoisie. In this session,
Yes, so the subjective petty bourgeoisie is the majority in the world, I think. That is, people who are poor, they're not members of a small business class. Many of them can be described as combatants or battlers because sometimes they hold 2 or 3 jobs. They work desperately day and night, and they're trying to ascend. That's the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Now, what's the counterpart to the subjective petty bourgeoisie in the United States?
so it's less about the United States. I'm just trying to clarify, because what we talked about today was quite different. You talked about, and there are things that I want to push you back on a little bit in that. But today you are already talking about objective class position versus consciousness as 2 distinct. That was one component. The second component,
Two elements, I don't know how distinct they are, but I'm trying to distinguish the different dimensions of this complex phenomenon.
But when you say objective and subjective petty bourgeoisie, you're not describing 2 aspects of the same class. You're defining the class in terms of poor and throughout most of the world in the informal economy. So objective conditions of work.
Which identifies itself as, or is a wannabe petty bourgeoisie.
So that brings the question of how important is the consciousness
Very
and how important is the material actual position in social relations of production.
Very important, because especially if it is backed theologically, as well as socially, as it is in countries like Brazil or India, it is very important. It enters deeply into the identity and orientation of the agent.
Important for what purpose?
Important, first of all, important for the individual himself in explaining what he wants to do with his life. But second of all, important for anyone who wants to understand his society and his place in it.
So this is one place where I think what I'm trying to do with class is different. I'm trying to create a diagnostic tool for identifying groups of people positioned differently with respect to production because they have different interests in the way in which production is organized, because they can become potential class allies. And so, for example, for me to say the asset holding class, but then to ignore the financial rentiers because they're a small number of rich, and to call the professional managerial class the asset holding class is problematic. Doctors and lawyers.
No, they're all rentiers. They're all rentiers. Someone who's in the casino every day, or in and out of the casino, is a rentier.
So you see no difference between doctors and lawyers on one hand, and heirs to family fortunes who have someone manage their family.
No, of course I see a difference.
So are they all asset, because you said that the professional
Yes.
managerial class is part of the asset owning class.
Yes, I'm saying that the activity that separates them out from the rest is capital. They have capital, and they can easily produce more of it through this activity.
So in my framework, that makes them rentiers if they don't actually then engage in
Yes,
production.
they are rentiers.
And it makes them capitalists if they take that money and also manage a business. And it makes them, but neither of those is true if their primary work is the cognitive work they do rather than the ownership. So the doctors and the lawyers, at least the lawyers who are not themselves the partners with 7
They're-
layers of associates below them, are different as a class than.
Well, their importance for society is different. But what I'm saying is separating out what their position in society. This is the most notable fact about them. The most notable fact about them is that they've accumulated small fortunes, and that when they die, no one will remember them. That's the most notable fact about them.
So again, because you said that the professional managerial class is part of the asset owning class. In fact, you said it was the most important.
I characterize them by the adjective that I think is most telling and most damning.
Well, but that, to me, that lumps analytically distinct groups of people that have potentially conflicting interests and therefore potentially conflicting positions in class coalitions with respect to program. So the doctors and the lawyers have a different relation to the project of artificial general intelligence than the owners of capital who are investing in these firms as
entrepreneurs I was referring to. The entrepreneurs are a tiny elite.
I'm not talking about the entrepreneurs, I'm talking about the capitalists, the people who actually combine both ownership and management or some cognitive work within production that they're doing. The entrepreneurs are small, but the number of companies in which there are capitalists is quite large and quite significant. You wanted to come in and ask a
I was
question.
curious if perhaps there's further delineation, as you were saying, Professor Beckler, between the lawyer who has 7 associates under them. I'm thinking about how you mentioned the cross-labor coalitions with unskilled and skilled between graduate student unions, Amazon workers. I was just thinking about this in particular with, for instance, like public defenders being within larger unions, like the United Auto Workers Union. So I'm curious if there's further distinction within just the professions themselves of lawyer.
I think it doesn't make much sense to reify these professions because the professions aren't serious or deep. let's not pick on lawyers, take endodontists, for example. So the endodontists are in the same situation. They can accumulate winnings of a few $1 million. It's easy in the United States to turn $500,000 into $5 million. And they perform this miracle of the multiplication of the loaves all the time. Then the country is run by a kind of bread and circus fashion in which the president of the republic has to amuse the uncredentialed masses, the uncredentialed workers, but has to at the same time keep the endodontists happy. That's a situation that's been organized in the United States.
Professor Winkler, this is a question for you about a class that Professor Unger identified, which is like kind of the small businessmen, like successful small business people who have like valuable businesses but aren't tapped into like sort of the main institutions of capitalism today. How you think about that and classify that?
So we essentially separate small business into two. Some are small capitalists, and in terms of their function and interest and alliance are allied with larger scale capitalists, but not necessarily with the rentiers who have potentially competing interests with respect to the regulation of finance, the monetary policy. There are and have been always tensions over monetary policy between the financial rentiers and the capitalists, particularly the non-exporting capitalists.
But these are secondary tensions, right? You know, I mean, the basic interest of this class of people who have assets is to have their equities continue growing in value. That's all they want. You call them rentiers?
Though I think there are distinct differences between those who actually are trying to run and build a business and grow, who might treat as capitalists.
Yes.
And those who actually just want to maximize financial returns. And yes, overall, their interests are closely aligned as they are. So for me, the profit-reaping classes have meaningful alliances much of the time, but meaningful divisions between the interests of the capitalists, the rentiers, and the professional managerial class on specific and important dimensions. On the question of, to me,
I think that in the age of fiat currency and of the current repertoire of post-Keynesian macroeconomic policies, the difference between the banker's ideology and the rentier's ideology has disappeared. It's the same thing. They want the same thing from the central bank, and they get it.
they certainly get it, and they have gotten it for a long time. But the interests with respect, but you have, so first of all, you're identifying a specific historical techno-institutional moment, the one that is characterized by what mostly is called financialization, where essentially real economy investment in the US becomes relatively small, and the entire class.
Well, we're going to discuss this, right? So
Yes, we are. But just looking historically, if you look at questions of transition to the gold standard, whether it's after the Napoleonic Wars in Britain in 1819 to 1821, whether it's the US after the Civil War, whether it's Germany and France in the 1870s, there's a real tension between the holders of bonds and financial assets who want the gold standard and exporters who want more freedom, monetary freedom and easier money in order not to be locked in. And so historically there are conflicts between these classes. It's true that in those countries where financialization takes over and the real economy shrinks in its influence, most capitalists at this point, when you have most of the revenue of GE for 40 years coming from GE Capital, that conflict gets essentially suppressed in favor of everybody turning into rentiers. But that's a specific that's a specific moment at which that distinction in the U.S. specifically, but not necessarily in other rich countries.
Well, that's why I gave the example of the United States, but I think what happens in this, as happens in many things, is the decodification of American exceptionalism as having a specific meaning. And the meaning is that the United States is out in front as the earliest and most extreme example of a tendency that then becomes generalized among the rich Western countries.
So, alternatively, what you see is that a global hegemon shifts toward financialization as newer economies come and fill in the manufacturing. You saw that with the Dutch rentier class in the 18th century as Dutch manufacturing loses out to British and later American. You see that, and you see that throughout the 18th century. You see in the late 19th to mid 20th century the same thing happening in the British Empire as they lose to
Japan and Germany didn't follow the example.
Japan and Germany are very distinct in this regard, and they never were the global hegemon in the same way that the United States has been, and they had a very focused productivist strategy going back to the 19th century, and then reestablished after World War II.
The United States has had this twin set of policies: consumption-led growth since the end of the New Deal, combined then with this financial hypertrophy. So the situation is that the vast majority of the funding of production is generated within the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's pointless.
And what I'm saying is, having an analytic structure of class allows you to look at different regimes within capitalism to understand the relative salience of different classes, and therefore the convergence or divergence of interests, and therefore the potential for a politics of change. And certainly in the US, most capitalists have become rentiers, and there's relatively little by way of capitalist activity outside of either the larger small businesses, going back to your question on small businesses. Some are smallholders. If they only employ themselves, their family, and maybe a tiny number of employees, their interests are closer to those of smallholders, and they continue. So the plumber with 2 or 3, mostly apprentice, on their own way to eventually becoming plumbers, or 10, I treat as an urban smallholder. Whereas the plumbing company with 50 plumbers and is a small capitalist. That's the division that I see as the distinction there, and it sounds like we agree on that.
It's still traditional small business.
Yes, which is why I'm saying I don't see small business as a single class. I see it as part of it is capitalist and part of it is smallholder. Crucially, with a potential conflict over how important employment relations are, and various policies for.
I tend to disagree. I think that a lot of these small businesses, plumbing businesses, landscape businesses, are right now being brought up by private equity firms in the United States. Then they change their logic. But up to that point, they were small businesses. in all fundamental respects.
The problem is that at least as far as the word small business is used in the US today, it's too broad. It covers
Sure, but it is
people
a
with
world-
100 employees.
I know, but it is a world, and the small business person, this figure that comes from the 19th century, can
He's
dive into his little world and spend his life in it.
And I see them as the continuation of smallholders. They are the shopkeepers of today.
Yes, they are a variation of that.
But they are being bought up by
I
private
think,
equity. They are becoming fully capitalist in their structure.
What I would
That's a
like-
major potential. So again, if you think why it's worthwhile, to think in terms of each individual small business owner is looking to what they can get out, particularly as they're entering retirement. But to understand as a consciousness, right? If you think today of small business owners in a relatively aging population, they have essentially two options. Option one is to sell to their workers through the ESOP, particularly if they're a little bigger. Option two is to sell to private equity. At the moment, there's no self-conception of this class and its relation either to its workers or to the potential capitalists to build a program in which you systematically suppress private equity acquisition in favor of transitioning these into small-scale cooperatives.
No, I'd like
But
to
that's a
take this
programmatic intervention.
opportunity to advocate for a past discussion we had in the course, which was this lost agenda of the 19th century, which was the agenda of the property-owning democracy, of the smallholders, not wage workers in the North. What happened to them? They were destroyed, and the precondition for their destruction after the Civil War is that they didn't come up with a solution to the problem of aggregation of scale within the traditional regime of property. That would have required a breakthrough, and that breakthrough would probably also have required a change in the character of American democracy. So this is a problem from long ago, in which there's a new opportunity now in the conditions of the knowledge economy, through cooperative activity, to find a solution to the 19th century problem, which was never solved.
And so, and just if we're evoking that portion, my answer there was, it's not so much that they didn't come up with the solutions, it's that they were defeated in their effort to implement, whether it was the Grange as cooperativism, whether it was the Farmers Alliance.
With respect to cooperative initiatives, but they had no solution with respect to property.
So with respect to aggregation of resources, they did come up with the sub-treasury. We talked about the sub-treasury program, where particularly the farmers, where they would get essentially a federal farmers bank that would use their smallholding land as a land bank and their grain as collateral for credit. And that was...
The fact is that John J.P. Morgan appeared in the horizon, and he said, they can't do it, but I can do it. I can do it through the power of money.
All of which is to say, what they lacked was the political power under an oligarchic constitutional system. Not that they lacked the ideas or...
No, they did lack the ideas, but one of the reasons why they lacked the ideas was they lacked the political power that would animate them to develop the ideas.
I don't know that if they had succeeded in winning the sub-treasury so that every farmer could actually put their grain in a public granary, get 80% of the cash flow and at long-term prices, they would not have been able to aggregate or for that matter, they ran on a platform of nationalizing the railroads or rate regulating the railroads so as to solve that particular problem of theirs. They lost. They lost politically because of an oligarchic constitutional system. I don't think it was their lack of ideas. I think it was their lack of political power and the constitutional structure with a deeply entrenched oligarchic judiciary defeating whenever they want.
I think they lacked also a doctrine of the market economy. The simple idea that a market economy has no natural and necessary form and that what they imagined in the 19th century as a kind of perpetual motion machine for the market was not true. That simple idea they never had. They never had it. And it took American legal thought 150 years to develop that idea, and it still hasn't been developed. And now that it's been developed, it still hasn't penetrated the inner sanctum of economics. So where would they get
We're
that
back to
idea?
that,
They
yes.
would come to Harvard College and they would learn the opposite.
Ideas are victors' ideas. Dominant ideas are the ideas of victorious classes, those that legitimate their power. If you're talking about
Yes,
recognition at this level
but the path of least resistance always has an enemy, and the enemies always have something going for them. What they have going for them is that the excluded ideas don't develop the collective possibilities to anything like the same degree that the heretical ideas can. If the heretics didn't have at least that going for them, they would really have nothing.
My primary point is that I think it's not, yes, ideas matter, and having the right understanding of how the economy actually works and how political economy actually works is crucial.
Well, let me say, put a low bar for this having ideas. In the 19th century, they developed a new kind of agricultural market, which had never existed in the world before, and they developed a new kind of financial market after the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States. Those two ideas are examples of the same idea. A market economy has no single natural and necessary form. That combination they never completed. That's not a high bar, that's a low bar.
And what I'm saying is that their sub-treasury idea was precisely to have a credit economy that was publicly facilitated and available to all farmers on a small scale, using as assets things they all possessed. And that was a way of creating a decentralized but publicly facilitated and publicly backed credit system that they saw, understood, and desired to be the opposite of what J.P. Morgan was developing.
Yeah, so-
Just J.P. Morgan had more legislatures in his pocket.
So Abraham Lincoln comes and delivers his talk to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society and says in a free economy, no one should be a wage worker. But he didn't go beyond that. He didn't go to the next step.
It's a timing issue. That's the moment at which the next step was essentially granting free land to actual settlers, the Homestead Act, which is the precondition to, and intentionally developed as a effort to prevent commodification and the emergence of European-style industrial wage labor.
Commodification, so that I want to take as a central point. Decommodification is not the way to go. The way to go is productivism. And productivism suits the temper of the country in a way in which decommodification does not.
And I think, and what I'm arguing is that
Decommodification comes from the world of Sweden, a small peasant society that became rich. And then the social democratic government said, we'll make a deal with you, Wallenberg. We'll let you keep all control of the Swedish economy so long as you allow us to finance the distribution of these entitlements to the majority of the Swedish population. And the Swedish Social Democratic Party accepted that deal.
the Swedish Social Democratic Party accepted that particular deal, but the point is that if you understand the role of extreme market dependence for subsistence, or full commodification of subsistence, as the primary driver of imperatives, you need that cushion, you need that partial decommodification as a precondition to any kind of freedom. Otherwise, you're just with your tongue out, constantly just looking for
We have
the
an
next
experiment. We have an experiment. We don't need Sweden for that. We have Franklin Roosevelt. And the first and two parts of the New Deal were that. They were decommodification. They were secure. They were focused on economic security, not on economic empowerment. They were focused on the restabilization of the economy, not on the radical democratization of the economy.
But you're
And-
unnecessarily slicing the bologna too thin. Because the decommodification, the partial decommodification is a base on which you then can layer productivist policies that train people and provide.
Not if all of the money goes to the decommodification.
But that's not where all of the money goes. You're creating an image of the system that is not reflective of the system that actually created the levels of productivity that you see there
In the
today.
New Deal, they did invest in some things that were productive.
As they did in Denmark and Sweden, and yes, these are not one-dimensional programs. But the precondition to having the freedom to do all of that is to liberate everyone from the incessant need to accept any kind of work, because otherwise you'll be hungry. That's a precondition.
There'll have to be selection of what forms of security to invest in, because it's very expensive. The American state is under fiscal stress. These initiatives will aggravate the stress, and it will make all the difference if the payment for the stress is directed to a process of economic growth, rather than to the distribution of entitlements.
It's not a rather than. You cannot do one without the other. You cannot, precisely as you say, you can't, because of the fiscal cost, you cannot sustain a high degree of decommodification of access to basic needs without intensive investment in making sure that the overwhelming majority of the population is actually working in a way that is productive and makes them not dependent on transfer payment. That's why you have higher workforce participation in the Nordics than in the US, let alone in some of the corporatist countries in Europe. You have high labor participation at relatively high investment in continuous human capital updating. But those are complements, not substitutes. They're part of the same program and only sustainable if you have both of them. Sorry?
Then we have to go to details, because I just think that that to say that the Netherlands, Denmark, and Canada will show the way to the United States is not, it's not plausible. The United States has to show the way to them.
This is undoubtedly the way Americans see it, and I think lacking in the ability to learn from successful projects that aren't.
They can see these projects in miniature, but they can turn from their current practice of this asset holding class. They can turn from the casino to what they were in the 19th century in the episodes that we explored. That too was the United States, but it was a different United States. And I think that now those early 19th century experiments are a much better guide to what the country needs than Roosevelt's New Deal.
Let me just give a couple of minutes to anybody who wants to jump in before we close. So we come then to the question of sources of inspiration. And I agree that historical examples are important. I also think that contemporary arrangements in other countries at the same productivity and technological frontier require far greater institutional attention than particularly where we've differed repeatedly is that I see the current version of the Nordic social democracies as valid and valuable examples that I think fit some of the things you're talking about far more than you're willing to acknowledge, and are doing it in a context that is technologically right there at the same frontier as we do. So when you look at the ways in which robotics are deployed in different societies, that gives you a different kind of insight than when you look at agricultural extension in the 19th
I have
century.
to agree with that. These examples deserve to be studied intensively.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I can't remember what we're doing next week, but we must have something in the agenda, so we'll probably talk about it then.
Is it finance or is it labor?
We'll find out in
Should
time.
someone look at the syllabus?
We give instructions for the final paper next week.
Okay, we'll give
The
instructions.
paper assignment has been distributed.
I think on the syllabus it said that you would talk about the topics today.
Comments?
Hmm?
Comments on the paper assignment?
I think the syllabus said that you would talk about the final assignment today.
And we would talk about it today.
Yeah. Well,
We posted it today.
it was posted, yes.
What do you want to say about it?
What do you want me to tell you about it?
Generally, what are we supposed to do? I know it's 20 double-spaced pages, but
You're supposed to criticize any aspect of the course, substantively or methodologically, that attracts your interest, and if possible, turn your criticism into the basis for some positive programmatic affirmation.
thank you.
So in other words, it's not a superfluous observation. You don't, you criticize because you want to transform. That's the spirit.
Thank you.
Can we base it on our own home countries instead of the United States?
It can be any country. It
Lovely,
says
thank you.
explicitly. Any country. And not necessarily your home country.